My name is Anita Nissen, and I'm a postdoc here at Aalborg University, as Oscar said. And today I will present one of my chapters from my book, which was also my PhD thesis. Yeah, I'll come back to that. But yes, actually what I want to do in this presentation is first to introduce the topic and then also present my book, since this is my first opportunity to do so I'm going to do that. And then just quickly a bit about the methods and data in terms of how I explored how this far-right coalition, Fortress Europe, how they create this Europeanized patriotism. So how do they talk about European identity, and how do they then unite transnationally as well? Just for you to get some context, I'm also just quickly going to introduce the subjects, which come from the PEGIDA groups mainly, and then how they started networking transnationally and then uniting in this coalition, Fortress Europe. And then I will look more into how they construct these them and us terms, and how they then transnationalize these constructs as well. And then how they then finally arrive at talking about themselves as these sorts of Europeanized patriots as well. Yes, so first of all, then this is, as I said, part of my PhD thesis, which has now become a book. So this book. It's basically in the book, and I'm studying two European transnational far-right networks, so Fortress Europe and Generation Identity. And then here I'm focusing on the refugee crisis from 15 to 17. In my research, I'm looking into the theory of Europeanization, and I'm considering both how they construct their frames around this, like these European notions of collective identity, and also their collective action frames. Then I'm also looking at the collective action. So I'm conducting a protest event analysis, where I then focus on the targets and participants and issues and the extent to which these are European. And finally, I'm also considering the networking, which I'll also bring a little bit into the talk today, but this talk is mainly on the frames that they construct. But yeah, I'm looking at how do they create these European alliances, and what is their longevity, like what is it that it takes for them to construct these sustainable alliances. But as I said, then I'm going to focus on the Fortress Europe network today, and I'm going to try and focus on the populist framing, but I have to say from the start that it's not an explicit focus in the thesis, but these are populist actors. So in that sense, what I will do is more focus on how they actually make their arguments European. So that's mainly like the focus on how this transnationalization process takes place at the discursive level. So I know populism is not a method, but I've just put the definition here that I'm working from, using Kasmulus, looking at populism as a thin-centered ideology, focusing on the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and to consider how this is being argued by these actors, I use a frame analysis by Snow and Benford, where I'm going to draw on the approach to collective action frames, so both looking at the problems, the solutions, and how they try to get people on the streets. And then I will focus more in on the collective identity frames, so how do they construct the in and out groups. So these in groups is of course a means for them to construct the in-group unity, and also to create this shared commitment to the cause. But of course, it's also a way in terms when they construct these outgroups to define the borders or the boundaries of who's part of the mobilization, but also, of course, who belongs to us as such. In terms of the data, then the primary sources is the main data that was collected. So I'm using Facebook and website data. So I just have to remember this was at the time where it was okay to use Facebook data. And then I've also conducted interviews with 4 key informants from PEGIDA Netherlands, from the Danish PEGIDA group, which is now called For Freedom, on the picture there, or For Frihed, and then also the French Republican Resistance, which became part of the network at a later time. But yes, if we start with the context, then we have, this is very much taking place during the so-called refugee crisis, and actually already starts in October 2014, where PEGIDA starts. I don't know if you all know PEGIDA. The Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the sorry, no, I lost. Anyway, Abendland. Anyway, yes. No, anyway, then then so they start their protests, and this very quickly starts to become a transnational format. So because especially after the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015, a lot of other European far-right activists mimic what the PEGIDA group in Germany is doing, and then they start setting up their own groups as well. And we also have a lot of other far-right organizations of various forms that start protesting. In many ways, we can say that this PEGIDA network is a continuation of the anti-Islam counter-jihad movement, which sort of started off in 2001 and has been changing format since then, but basically revolves around this opposition to so-called Islamization. And there's a very good book by Berntsen, which I would recommend if you want to read more into this. So the PEGIDA groups very much start appearing in Western Europe, but at the same time, we also see that in April and May, the anti-refugee quota protests in Eastern Europe. So there's both parties and far-right groups, protest groups that start this type of objection to what the EU is trying to impose on the different member states. So in the same time, then the PEGIDA group in Germany is actually plummeting a bit in support. There's not that many people who turn up at the protest anymore. But then because of the high number of refugees that start entering during the summer, then we see that there's a research in the participants because the political opportunities and discursive opportunities start rising again. So because of this becomes a very transnational phenomena of these types of protests against refugees, we also see that these actors start collaborating, or at least trying to create alliances across the borders. In October, we see that the German PEGIDA group and the Czech Bloc Against Islam, they start having meetings and start discussing what they can do together to curb this inflow of refugees, basically. So then we also see the entrance of Tommy Robinson, from who you might know from the English Defence League. He then starts joining the PEGIDA protest as well. And he proposes this future transnational protest. Of course, he's if you study the far right, then you know that he's quite a big name on the scene and can really collect people because he already has quite a substantial network across Europe because of the attempts to make the Defence League transnational as well. So he's at this time already started to recruit groups to make these transnational protests, calling for this far right unity. To counter the common enemy, basically. So then in November, we have the PEGIDA Germany and Bloc Against Islam and the Czech Usvit party. They then begin inviting groups to this transnational protest in 2016. So then what follows then is in January the 23rd of January 2016, the groups unite in Prague, and here you can see the list of participants. Sorry, you cannot. But it's basically the different PEGIDA groups. Sorry, there's a weird sound. Sorry, could you switch off your microphone? Thank you. No. Okay, I will try to switch now. So basically, this network is a very diverse group of actors, as you can see. So we both have political parties, also some of the bigger ones, so Lega from Italy, the National Movement from Poland, and also the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, which has had quite a good elections. Not the National Movement, but ECRE. yeah, so basically, so it's of course very diverse group, so both in terms of the organization types, but also the ideology. So we have this very much this division between that some of the actors, mainly the parties, they focus on the protection of the national identity as their core issue, versus the anti-Islam groups that are more focused on the European or civilizational identity. At the same time, we also see divisions in their focus or how they perceive Russia. So you have groups that are very much against Russia as the political entity, of course, because of the history and so on. And on the other hand, we have actors that are very much pro-Russia. But this, they then very early on decide to just not focus on and not even discuss because they know that will lead to tensions. So what they do have in common, though, is that they are all organizing demonstrations or in other ways making collective action and collective calls to curb the refugees entering Europe. And they basically align around this objection to Islam, immigration, the EU, and also the establishment. I'll now come back to the construction of this. So basically what they all want to unite around is this pan-European opposition to Islam and migration and the elites. So in this sense, this common call, which has also been seen before, when you look at far-right transnational efforts, that is enough for them to unite at the transnational level in the first place, of course. Then the question then becomes, how can they then sustain this cooperation? Then from this meeting, then they join forces for this transnational demonstration. So across Europe in the distinct capitals of these various groups. And this is in February in 2016. And at the same time, they try to set up this European Citizens Initiative at the EU level, but this largely fails because there's not enough support to actually mobilize people to get all those signatures that are needed. So at this January meeting, what they also do is that they set up this Prague Declaration, they call it. And this is very much focused on this European identity or the attempt to construct this European us. And so in this sense, what they try to do is to unite this nationalism and also Europeanism. So to begin with, so you can see the document to the right there. But what the key focus here is this very pending doomsday prophecy here. So we have the 1,000-year history of Western civilization could soon come to an end through Islam conquering Europe. So what they then also say is that it's the political elites that have betrayed us, so it's their fault that this is happening. So what they then call for is this strong defense of Europe. Because, as they say, they will not surrender Europe to their enemies, and they are prepared to stand up and oppose Islam and extreme Islamic regimes, and at the same time, they're European collaborators, which I'll turn back to who exactly that is. And here we then see this very strong bravery discourse as well, because they're prepared to risk their freedoms, properties, jobs, and careers, and maybe even put their own lives at stakes to counter this. At the same time, there's also big criticism of the EU and globalization because they refuse to submit to the Central European government, and also they go up against the global elites that only brought poverty, unemployment, corruption, chaos, and moral collapse. So we can see it's a very strong antagonist construction that is going on here. And then here comes where the national comes in, because then at the same time they also are very adamant that sovereignty cannot be infringed. So the European nations, all of them, their sovereignty must be respected, and the borders should be protected, and also each state should be allowed to decide which immigrants to accept and which not. So I think that one, I guess, is also very much related to the quotas, the question of that the EU wanted to say how many and which people should go to each EU member state. And yes, then finally, in terms of the European identity, then what they call to this common European roots, traditions, and values, as well as the historical alliances of the nations. So here we can also see a little bit of a glossing over of the fact that maybe, yes, we were not always allies across Europe, but this is sort of, not really digged more into. So what they can see, or that what they attempt to create, is this reference to the history of where we as Europeans actually stood together and fought. And this I will also come more back to. So basically what we can see is, if we look at the antagonists, or who they then see as the others, or as the them, then for one, and very clearly, it's Islam, and it's 5 minutes left, and its adherents. So they talk very much about this conquering of Europe and the ongoing Islamization, what they refer to as Islamization, which is very much referred to in terms of security, so terrorist attacks and violence, and also cultural tropes. I guess I don't need to go too much into what they refer to here. And also we see this liberal Islamophobia, so Mongdong and Winter's concept, which basically is this idea that they use these liberal claims to say what is wrong with Islam. For instance, in terms of freedom of speech is a very prominent one. But yeah, what they also do is create this opposition to both the domestic and the European elites. So this is not only in this document, of course, this is what they largely also argue at their protests and so on. So they feel very betrayed by the elites, and also accuse them of being behind the refugee crisis. So in some places they're referred to as collaborators, as we saw in the document. But at the same time, they also oppose the so-called do-gooders, or Gutmenschen in the German PEGIDA group's language. So basically, this idea of these like ignorant left-wing proponents of liberalism who basically allow the people to enter. And at the same time, in the same vein, we also have these politically correct people that inhibit the freedom of speech and the freedom of opposing what is going on. Then they also casually mention the cultural Marxists at various times, not really delving into what they actually refer to, but they are blamed for the multiculturalism in Europe. And also at the same time, they feel very wrongly portrayed by the lying press. Then they also do talk about EU, or the European Union, but this is not really a key concern, or not a key framing in their argumentation. But there is opposition to the central European government, and again, the sovereignty argument is very strong. And then they refer to this dictatorial output, also refer to it as undemocratic. And then at the same time, there are also very varied stances on the forms of exits, or like whether or not their states should be part of the EU or not. So what they then do in terms of constructing us, then there's these very vague references that we as Europeans are all united in this European cultural and historical community. So for instance, Tommy Robinson in one speech talks about our connections by geography, history and culture, and that this is what should make us want to collaborate transnationally. But again, this is very vaguely defined, and I don't really delve into, so what does this actually mean, this cultural and historical community? But what it allows them to do is to create this very exclusionary European in-group versus the others. So by saying that we are part of the same, then they can also easily say that they are not. Then we also have this very interesting construction of, I refer to it as European patriotism, or Europeanized patriotism. Which is basically this idea that because we love our own country so much, we need to stand united at the European level to be able to protect our borders. So we have a good quote from an interview with the Danish PEGIDA group. So what she says is that we cannot exist in a vacuum in such a small country as ours, and we are a very, very small country. We should preferably be able to coexist with the countries around us. We respect all countries and their sovereignty. PEGIDA in Germany, they fight for the Germans and for their culture, and for freedom in Denmark, we fight for Denmark and our Danish culture. At the same time, we agree that all our European countries can keep their culture, that we help them keep their culture. Another example is from the French interview, or the interview with the French respondent. He says, "I love France first. I'm first French before being European, but I recognize that for me, the European civilization is without equal in the world." So we see this very, like, this idea that, that the West or Europe is basically the best. Oh, so running out of time. So what they also do is then unite about these idea of being to be strong, that we need to unite and be together. And they create many of these solidarity tropes around that we need to help each other become a bigger group. And this is also enabled by the references to Eastern Europe as still being able to be saved. So it's not facing the same hurdles as Western Europe. And they also often highlight actors like Orban for being a role model for objecting to the EU. Also, they have this, they also unite around the experiences of national repression, and I'm so, yes, okay, anyway, so what they do then, in the end, all of these leads them then to say that they're the prosecuted and excluded, but at the same time, they're also the brave who dare to speak up against this. So they construct this European form of liberation from the resistance movement. So also they make out many of these war references, for instance, referring to the Ottomans and the Crusades. So again, this idea of the Europeans fighting together. And also at times they call for this more armed response to the crisis. And some of them even ended up supporting this Bulgarian vigilant border patrollers who basically went out into the forest to stop refugees from entering. So basically, now I'll stop. Sorry, Martin. So what we see though is that Project Europe was very short-lived. They had internal strifes and they also very quickly lost momentum. And then so the network basically ended. But what we can very clearly see is again there are these uniting tropes for how European far-right groups that they can actually transnationalize their contention. So yes, I'll stop there. But yes, if you want to know more, I guess you can read my book.